"I seen it," Gaston said. "Seen what?" Johann asked. Ludmilla stood amongst the currently being pillaged remains of the third goblin settlement for the day. The Imperial Knights methodically sifted through everything as they worked to locate anything of value. The day's gains thus far were mostly unremarkable, consisting of the same assortment of tribal trinkets, animal products and not much else. What she was talking about, Gaston answered. Who ran? Who fought? Why they fought? The ranger had an expression on his face suggesting that he didn't like what he now realized. Ludmilla took it as a sign of progress. It was the ones that had weapons that fought, the warriors, I guess. Them and the old-looking sort. Everyone else ran. They grabbed their kids and ran, and their warriors tried to buy time for them to run. We just rode them down no matter what they were doing. The more, the better. Like getting more meant something. Even a hungry monster leaves after they get their fill. Nearby, Paul looked up from where he had kicked aside the litter under a goblin lean-to. If we didn't do it, he told the ranger, some other guy'd do it and get the credit. But don't you see? Gaston replied, it's like she said. If it were a farm village and Demis came and did that, we'd call them savages and hate their asses forever. Ludmilla walked over to the group of men, who looked up from their conversation with different questions on each of their faces. What is it that allows you to do what you're doing? She asked, practically speaking. 'Cause we're soldiers, m'lady, Paul said. We trained to be strong. What have you gained through your exercise of strength here? That's whatever we looted, plus the land we're clearing. What did it cost you? The cavalier frowned, looking around the camp. His gaze finally settled on his spear. Might have damaged my spear, but it's the army's, I guess. Can get that fixed, too. Was what you gained worth what it cost you? Well, yeah, Paul nodded. This is easy stuff. Get paid for it, too. Ludmilla turned her attention to Gaston. Would you say you gained the same thing? She asked. Yes, m'lady. What did it cost you? Makes me feel like shit, the ranger frowned. Even if I get some land after this, I'll always remember what we did to get it. Who would you say is correct, Priest Ward? The sandy-haired cleric visibly recoiled at the question. His green eyes darted between the two men. Our gods do not say anything for or against demi-humans, he said after several moments. It is not wrong to defend ourselves and retaliate against savage demi-humans who visit evil upon our frontier folk, but I have no idea whether these demi-humans have ever done so. Rather than dwelling upon the demi-humans themselves, the faith of the Four concerns itself with spiritual matters. What spiritual matters might those be? Moral decay, Joachim said. I am not the only one to worry over recent developments. Until recently, the Imperial Army has mostly served an honorable and righteous cause, the defense of the Baharuth Empire. The Empire's war with Reastais was justifiable in the fact that we would bring succor to the millions suffering under the mismanagement of its decadent and corrupt aristocracy. This campaign, however, greed seems to drive everything. Greed implies that one's behavior is overly self-serving, Ludmilla noted. Paul wants some land where he can build a hamlet and provide a living for his future family. His life before joining the army was as a laborer in Enns. That work barely afforded him a cramped room in the lowest class district. Is he greedy for wanting to improve his situation? For wanting a healthy place to raise a family and create a small community? For putting his life on the line to do so? Of course not, my lady. The problem lies with how our soldiers are doing it. This ambition just seems to take on a life of its own. With every passing day, I look less at the demi-humans and more at our own men, worrying over how they've transformed as a whole. Roughly half of her men shifted uncomfortably at the cleric's words. The Empire worked to suppress the influence of the temples and cultural elements that it identified as undesirable, but it seemed that the religion's hold on the hearts and minds of the people was still strong enough to have them measure their efforts through more than just the lens of cold practicality. Time's up. The men dropped what they were doing at General Ray's voice, jogging off to mount their war horses once again. The rumbling of hooves filled the air as they gathered on his lead and headed south towards their next objective. Their pace was significantly slower as outriders searched for ways ahead and the company split into columns that moved through gaps between the trees. Ludmilla eyed the surroundings, alert for the presence of demi-human scouts, but those watching from the distant undergrowth would likely be undetectable even to the Imperial Army's best rangers, never mind herself. Riding a warhorse also presented challenges in the forested terrain. Like any noble, she had experience with regular mounts, but she had grown accustomed to riding ones with closer to human intelligence like Soul Eaters or Elishnish. Her bond with the Frost Dragon allowed them to effortlessly function together as mount and rider, so being on a horse felt like a lot more work despite being nowhere near as complex as riding a dragon. After an hour of guiding her borrowed mount along the narrow forest trails, Ludmilla breathed a sigh of relief as they rode out into a large clearing. Then, she frowned as the sounds of battle rose from the demi-human encampment ahead. All along the northern tree line, Imperial knights streamed out of the woods, charging straight into throngs of demi-humans distracted by the attacks of hippogriff riders above. Cave on the eastern edge. Tormel, Caden, take your squads and burn out whatever's in there. Ludmilla guided her horse towards the location that General Ray indicated, watching as the two squads sent their scouts to investigate the interior. Several minutes later, they came back out and re-entered with 4 heavy infantry and 2 war wizards. The shadows of the cave flared an angry orange as several explosions echoed out from its entrance. She caught the attention of one of the rangers on his way out. What was in there? Some sort of direbear, milady, the ranger replied. Things are around difficulty rating 60, so it's good that we caught those demis before they woke it up. Where we killed it probably ruined the pelt, though. It's better than losing multiple squads of men, Ludmilla said. Your officers made the prudent choice. Thank you for letting me know. The ranger offered a salute before turning back to examine the cave's surroundings. Ludmilla turned her attention to the rest of the clearing. As with previous assaults, the shock of being suddenly attacked by 100 mounted soldiers was too much for the inhabitants to reasonably react to. There was no sign of resistance from strong individuals and most of the demi-humans had already been swept from the clearing. It's the same as before, Destin said from nearby. Well, it's not exactly the same, but you can see what they're doing. These goblins, even the ogres, they're just reacting like people would. Why didn't we see it before? How did you know about all this, milady? My house was not in a position where we could simply overpower our demi-human neighbors, Ludmilla said, so we had to understand how they behaved and why. Rather than feeling like a wretch over the fact, you can refine your tactics now that you're beginning to see them for what they are, yes? What do you mean by that, milady? Gaston said from the other side of her. Ludmilla dismounted to give her warhorse a break before addressing the 2 rangers. The 2 of you joined after the 6th Legion was reorganized, if I recall correctly. Yes, milady. What special training did they give you? What sort of work did you do beforehand? I was from one of the 4th-class districts in our winter, Gaston said. Just got by doing what I could. I guess I sorta had a reputation as a troublemaker. That's how I got recruited. You mean they enlisted you as a rogue? Gaston nodded, pointedly avoiding her gaze. Being a ranger and a rogue didn't seem like a bad combination. He would be especially potent in ambush scenarios. What happened then? It didn't make much sense being a rogue in the 6th, so I got into ranger training. A lot of familiar things between them and I actually liked it. Life's good out here once you know up from down, better than the city. Ludmilla turned her gaze to Destin. I was a forester's son, Destin said, so being a ranger was right up my alley. Up my tree? Anyway, I just went from that to this. The sergeants mostly had us do, well, ranger things. At least the ranger things that the Imperial Army wants out of us. Scouting, bushcraft, archery. What about training against specific opponents? Ludmilla asked, demi-humans, monsters or magical beasts? A couple of the guys wanted to become beast masters for the air wing, Gaston said, but there wasn't enough time for all the training needed. We just learned basic stuff like the other recruits. I see, she nodded. In that case, as a fellow ranger, I'll share a little secret with you. The 2 rangers swallowed, glancing around before stepping in closer to her. Ludmilla couldn't help but smile at their wide-eyed anticipation. It's not that big of a secret, she said. Think of it as more of a different angle to look at things. Rangers have certain subjects that they favor and they develop skills and abilities based on that. It's something that we recognize, but we recognize it in a way that seems like common sense to us. Rangers who make a living off of the game that they bring back from the woods are usually recognized as hunters, but they are actually rangers specializing in beasts. The beast masters you mentioned specialize in handling magical beasts. Rangers who defend the Empire's borders will most often deal with demi-human tribes, so they end up as demi-human specialists. That kinda makes sense, Destin said, but does it really work that way? There's something for everything? It does, Ludmilla replied. The more powerful you become as a ranger, the more pronounced your specializations will be. And there is something for everything. I know an adventurer ranger who specializes in the undead, while rangers working in law enforcement specialize in humans. So since we've been fighting and learn about demi-humans, Gaston frowned, we're gonna end up as demi-human specialists? Considering the mandate of the 6th Legion, Ludmilla said, it's probably one of the best ones to have. With your understanding will come insight that can be used to both fight against and work with demi-humans. Special skills and abilities are something that you'll have to grasp and develop, but what's most important to the army and the men you work with is that they learn to trust your expertise as a ranger. The way that rangers inevitably came to specialize in at least one enemy type was something Ludmilla had been counting on as a way to bring awareness to the members of her squad and eventually the men of General Ray's battalion. Once a ranger settled on their favored targets, learning about them became mysteriously quick and intuitive. They became naturally proficient at all activities revolving around those favored targets, which not only included tracking, trapping, intimidating and fighting against them as opponents but understanding their behavior and how to interact with them in more peaceful scenarios. Because they had no previous education on specific target types, they had no specialization. Their time in Ray's battalion had them focusing on demi-humans. Now, it appeared that they were finally awakening to this ability that was innate to all rangers. Destin and Gaston looked over to where the other men in her bodyguard were picking through the demi-human camp. I don't think they'll just listen to us, Destin said. They got their whole other thing going on. You asked why you didn't notice what I pointed out about demi-humans before, Ludmilla said. You're probably also wondering why the others don't see it. I've put a lot of thought into it since it's something that happened to me in the past as well. Not anymore? Not in the Sorceress Kingdom, Ludmilla replied. The Sorcerer King's direct vassals and those in their entire chain of command see things very differently than people in this part of the world do. They don't question whether professionals know their work. A farmer with the requisite experience will produce results within a reasonable range of expectations. A smith will reliably produce goods according to their standard. To be frank, it's never wrong, but people here have trust issues, perhaps. People can also believe what they want to believe even if it doesn't make much real sense. So they just take you at your word. Things just are. Perhaps one day you'll get to work with a Death Knight or a Death Warrior and experience how different it is. If you spot something and call it out, they won't second guess you. If you say someone ran a certain way, they'll believe you because you're a ranger and rangers can track. If you fail at something one day, it's not directly your fault and they won't resent you for your failure. It was just something that was beyond you and that's just the way things are. They'll still trust your skills the next time. That's a pretty positive outlook. It is, Ludmilla agreed. The Death Series servitors are very pleasant to work with. In their minds, everyone is trying their best and they try their best too. The general called for another move. They found themselves following the river south over a floodplain covered by a web of shallow meltwater streams. Destin raised his voice to speak to the others along the way. Hey guys, mind if I mark out targets this next time around? Trying for Sergeant? Frank asked. No, Destin answered. I just wanted to see something. Ludmilla's bodyguard looked toward her. I don't mind, she said, but if something silly happens, I'll be intervening. Yes, milady, Destin said. Thank you, milady. Just listen up, I guess. Their pace quickened as the company closed with a large demi-human settlement along the riverbank. With plenty of warning as they rode up the river, their opponents had ample time to prepare. Fan out. Push them up the riverbank and into the trees. The other squads moved to follow General Ray's orders. Destin continued straight ahead, peering at the broad expanse of simple shelters dotting the slope. After a dozen seconds, he nodded. This way. Ludmilla's bodyguard veered sharply to the right, angling directly towards a ramp at the base of a steep rise. A swarm of goblins and ogres awaited them, arms and voices raised in a tribal threat display. The tip of Winston's spear lowered slightly as they approached. You sure about this, Destin? Yeah, Destin replied. He's right, Gaston said. Look up top. What the hell is that? Overlooking the unfolding chaos was a particularly large ogre flanked by a group of trolls. Layers of hides adorned its shoulders and it waved a small tree around as it shouted at its fellows. An Overlord, Ludmilla said. You'll lose all of your momentum trying to charge up there and he'll slap you all the way back down. What do we do? Don't fight too close to that rise, you'll get a rock on the head. Let's take a slice off of their right flank and see if they chase us. Stay mobile. Johann, take point. The squad's formation shifted as the Cavaliers formed a wedge behind Johann. Ludmilla eyed the roiling mass of dozens of demi-humans. Gaston, Destin, do you see those mystics? Yes, milady. Keep them suppressed, killing them is fine if you can. Those without bonded mounts will need to stay out of range. One charm spell and you'll be on the ground with 30 demi-humans waiting to bash your skull in. Half of the squad trailed off from the charge, sending arrows and crossbow bolts into the demi-human ranks. Johann's wedge clipped off a dozen defenders, lances breaking on ogres while their warhorses sent goblins flying into the air. They angled away but nothing followed them save for rocks and makeshift wooden javelins. That lord is strong enough to stay in control of his troops. Regroup on me. She took them out of the goblins' bow range, stopping on a gravelly islet a little over 100 meters from the base of the ridge. Joachim and Redwin tended to the cuts and scrapes sustained by her cavaliers. Can we still send arrows their way, milady? Gaston asked. Go ahead, but save a few just in case. The supply horses are a few hundred meters south of us right now. Arrows and crossbow bolts darted over the field. Most were caught on crude shields of wood and hide, but several managed to find their marks. Is there something we can do? Igval frowned at the demi-human's defensive position. I don't think we can break into that. You're soldiers, not heroes, Ludmilla said. This is a company-level threat for the Imperial Army, so the company will help to deal with it. Ludmilla turned her gaze northward, searching for General Ray along the pebbled riverbank. General Ray, there's one Overlord and his warband on the north ridge overlooking the river. We've tested them and they're holding their position. Then I hope that they're stubborn. Sending captain's aid from our end. She scanned the skies to the south for signs of the dragoon captain and his flight. As she did so, something else caught her attention. Destin, Gaston, Ludmilla pointed to a trio of winged figures overhead and to the south. Do you see those? Yeah, what about them? They're not ours. Gaston narrowed his eyes. Dragons? Wyverns, Ludmilla corrected him. We have an audience from further south. Nearly flush against the mountainside, Captain Zaid and his flight descended as they approached the Ogre Lord's ridge. Captain Zaid is coming in, she said. Johann, time a fake charge and keep that warband size on us. Yes, milady, here. The cavalier urged his warhorse into a trot, leading his wedge purposefully towards the entrenched demi-human ranks. Hold your arrows, Ludmilla told the others. They need to stop shielding their heads. When Johann came within 40 meters of them, a fireball streaked in from above, exploding in the middle of the packed ranks at the base of the ridge. Ouch, Frank winced. You had 'em lower their shields and focus on Johann so they wouldn't accidentally block the fireball? Yes. To Ludmilla's right, Johann looked purposely towards her. She eyed the flaming gap in the warband's ranks. Above them, the Ogre Lord and his escort had their heads turned towards the skies. To the north, Captain Zaid and his flight were wheeling around for another strafing run. Captain Zaid, can you soften up that lord up top? That was the plan, my lady. Was something the matter? No, I'm sending in my cavaliers to clean up the mess you left down below. I didn't want them to get roasted. If you could do that, we'll be able to attack the ridge directly on the third pass. We'll see you there. Ludmilla turned her attention back to Johann. Johann, Captain Zaid is hitting the ridge next. Time your charge with his next pass. Hit what's left of the ones below. The rest of us will join you at the bottom of the ramp. They rode in behind the Cavaliers' third charge. The remains of the demi-human formation didn't have the weight to stop them and broke apart. Flames blossomed out over the edge of the ridge as Captain Zaid's flight made its second pass. Arrows found a few of the defenders while Frank and Igval dismounted and moved to clean up what was left. They eventually came to the bottom of the ramp where the squad formed up behind them. We going up now? Frank asked. Looks like 3 squads are coming join us from the south. Captain Zaid is dropping, Ludmilla answered. We can't leave him without support for that long. Let's go. 2/3 of the way up the ridge, the squad stopped to crouch after another fireball slammed into the ridge above. Don't stop. You're ducking for a fireball that already happened. Spells go where they're supposed to go, and reacting like you just did kills your momentum. The squad picked themselves up and rushed forward. Harsh cries drifted down from above. Igval made it to the top first, immediately slashing open the back of a troll's knee. Over here, ugly. The troll twisted around at Igval's taunt, collapsing onto its injured leg. A scorching ray spell from Captain Zaid's war wizard found the fallen demi-human as a half-dozen men hacked and stabbed at it. That was a neat trick, Frank said. Yeah, sure, just like I planned. Ludmilla's bodyguard spread out over the top of the ridge, joining Captain Zaid and his 2 dragoons as they faced off against the Overlord and 4 trolls. She glanced between the combatants. Your drop was a bit ambitious, wasn't it, Captain? Maybe just a bit. Igval, take Ward and half the men and work on one of these trolls ganging up on the dragoons. The rest are with Frank for another. You'll have to hit them hard, but be careful. She called her glaive to hand, wary of any risks to her men as she watched them work together to bring down their targets. With the skilled war wizard attentively supporting them from above, however, they methodically took down their respective opponents. What remained was the Overlord and 2 trolls squaring off against Captain Zaid and his 2 wingmates. The 2 men were holding out against their respective opponents, but Captain Zaid was being overpowered. The captain was roughly the strength of a lower gold rank adventurer, while the Overlord was midway through mithril. Only his desperate focus on defensive arts was keeping him alive against brutal swings that must have been close to the power of a Death Knight. Ludmilla stepped forward, activating ability boost. She used an upward slash to lop off the Overlord's right arm below the elbow. The demi-human let out an anguished howl as the tree and the limb holding it crashed to the ground. A twist of her wrist adjusted the angle of her weapon as she prepared another slash. Her reverse stroke cleaved through the demi-human lord's neck just below the jaw, the blade exiting its body from the opposite armpit. The headless and armorless body of the Overlord crashed to the ground. The 2 remaining trolls wasted no time fleeing at the sight of their fallen leader, bowling over the dragoons in their desperate flight towards the trees. An awkward silence fell over the ridge, punctuated by the sounds of diminishing battle. Ludmilla flicked the blood off of her glaive. Apologies for interrupting your fight, she informed Captain Zaid. But I felt that your opponent presented an untenable risk. She turned and walked towards the overlook, putting her glaive away by hand. All along the riverbank, the demi-humans had broken and were scattering into the trees with the loss of their lord. The Imperial Knights that had previously been locked in combat with them pursued, cutting them down as they ran. Ludmilla sighed, shaking her head as she watched. Her gaze turned up to the 3 distant wyverns observing the battle from the skies. The 6th Legion probably wasn't making a good impression. The sound of metal plates filled the air as the squad sent by General Ray finally made it to the top of the ramp. You missed it, Paul smirked as he leaned on his spear. Ludmilla turned back around, eyeing the dragoon captain. Did General Ray have any further instructions, Captain Zaid? Nothing since the strike order, Captain Zaid replied. We look about done here, anyway. What's going on with those wyverns? Captain Zaid turned his gaze towards the southern skies. We first noticed them about an hour ago, he said. They have riders, but we've been keeping our distance from one another. What do you know about the wyvern rider tribes? Aside from stories that say they exist, nothing. They've never come anywhere near the Imperial border. Anyway, back to the skies with us. Thank you for the assistance, my lady. Ludmilla nodded at the captain's salute. She looked around at the squads on the ridge, who were mostly gathered around the corpse of the Overlord. Take inventory of the fallen and their camp, she told them. The general will want us ready to move as quickly as possible. The squads dispersed, leaving Ludmilla with her bodyguard. They and their equipment appeared to be in good condition. She activated her Eclipse mana essence. Ward, Redwin, mana? About half done, milady, Redwin replied. Same here. Was that correct? Mana essence should have been precise, but what she saw through it did not match their responses. What qualifies as half in the Imperial Army, Priest Ward? Halfway to the point that we experience mana exhaustion, my lady. That explained that. Mana exhaustion manifested before one actually ran out of mana, but it was a crippling condition that rendered magic casters not only combat ineffective but also inflicted severe physical exhaustion. Running someone entirely out of mana meant that they had to be carried away. It was not something a squad wanted happening during operations. As far as she knew, Elder Liches and Death Priests did not suffer from mana exhaustion, likely because the undead were immune to physical exhaustion. It seemed like yet another advantage that the undead held over the living. You should take care of the searched corpses while you have a chance, she told the clerics. The Second Legion's companies always reserved half mana for the return to camp. Is that true here, as well? It hasn't happened yet, my lady, Joachim replied, but I don't see why it should be any different. In fact, we should be more cautious given how deep in the wilderness we are. Yeah, Redwin said. Bennett should be on top of things, though. The general's an aggressive campaigner, but not to the point where he'll risk wearing down his soldiers to nothing. The men settled into the familiar routine of plundering their battle's aftermath. Though he was attired differently from the rest of his tribe, the Overlord did not appear to have any magic items or even crafted equipment. He did not use any martial arts, either, simply employing brute force. She supposed that it was a lucky thing for Captain Zaid. Form up on the double. We're headed back to camp. The men dropped what they were doing and filed down the ramp to the riverbank. Ludmilla narrowed her eyes at the general's tone. They rejoined the company as they rode back north along the shore and she made way to General Ray at the center. He turned to pass a cursory gaze over her. Lady Zaradnik, he nodded, I'm glad you're unharmed. Your orders seemed urgent, Your Excellency. Not my orders, he replied. General Gregan's. Demi-human activity in the Highlands has changed and he's halted our advance. A meeting of his general staff has been called. Hippogriffs are on their way to pick us up. She looked over at the mountains to the east. What could put the advance of an entire legion on hold? Were there no additional details? Not as such, no. But his initial orders gave enough away. The 4th and 5th divisions are coming into this valley. They'll be occupying and expanding 2 of the outposts we've set up. He wants the 6th Legion to push into the plateau? Or is it containment? It has all the tells of a defensive reaction, so likely that General Gregan has tentative containment in mind while we make sense of what's going on. Their route followed the river all the way back to the battalion's 3rd outpost, where an Imperial Air Service flight with an extra pair of hippogriffs were already awaiting them. The men of her bodyguard looked to her for orders. How long will this meeting have us away for, Your Excellency? She asked. Between travel time and everything else, General Ray answered, we'll probably be tied up until tomorrow morning, at least. Will 15 minutes be long enough to ready what you require, my lady? Yes, I'll be right back. She jogged over to her tent, quickly putting her furniture and magic items away. Outside, Joachim Wood was waiting for her by the fire. Did you have any instructions for the men, my lady? He asked. They don't have any camp duties like the rest of the battalion, Ludmilla answered, so take advantage of the opportunity to perform drills for the martial arts they've been aiming for. You and Priest Redwin will have plenty of mana to work with, so make sure you use it for training. They did well today helping assault that position, and the reason why certain techniques must be learned will be more apparent to them now. I'll let them know. Have a safe trip, my lady. Ludmilla returned to the center of the camp where a dragoon waited for her with her hippogriff. Have you ridden a hippogriff before, my lady? I have, she replied. A short flight out of Enns. The dragoon held out a burnished metal brooch. This item will bestow an endure elements effect on the wearer, he explained. It will keep you comfortable in the cold. We're over 100 kilometers to Eoten and we'll be cutting over the mountains to the northeast. She received the item with a smile of thanks, pinning it near the clasp of her mantle. It was one of the many common places where one might have an accessory, but no magic items of that sort had been included with either of her outfits and she wasn't sure why. Ludmilla activated the item, but because she was immune to cold and had fire resistance items, she couldn't tell whether it was working or not. With a single, smooth movement, she mounted the hippogriff. The magical beast let out a surprised squawk as she landed in the saddle, turning an incredulous eye at her. Ludmilla returned its look with an apologetic one, raising a finger to her lips and activating her flight item to negate the weight of herself and her equipment. General Ray appeared from the direction of his pavilion with 2 bags slung over his shoulders. The dragoon at his hippogriff helped him to mount. "I see that you're ready to go, my lady," the general said. "Magical containers are a wonderful convenience, Your Excellency." "I can only imagine," he snorted. "If we had one for every Imperial Knight, our logistical expenditures would be a tenth of what they are now." The dragoon captain took wing, followed by the rest of his flight. They slowly ascended the valley on steady wing beats that eventually brought them over the highland plateau to the east. Ludmilla studied the rugged, mountainous woodland, trying to gain a sense of why General Gregan had halted their operations in the wilderness. "Are you from the 1st Division camp, Captain? Do you know what's going on in the highlands below? Something started to rally the demi-humans a few days after we all started pushing in, my lady. They're organizing fast, so we suspect it's a hobgoblin general." "You haven't found their headquarters?" "Not yet. It's a big, unfamiliar wilderness. There are probably 1,000 caves and other hiding places down there." If it was night, she might have been able to spot movement under the presumed cover of darkness. In the bright afternoon, however, she couldn't see anything at all, probably because they were wary of being spotted from a distance while they organized. "What are the estimates so far for their forces?" "Anywhere from 5,000 to 50,000. Our flights are working as quickly as possible to gather intelligence, so the picture should be much clearer by the end of the day." Aoten came within sight as they crossed over to the northern slopes of the plateau, though their flight did not bring them to the fortress town. Instead, they landed in an encampment 10 kilometers east of it, not far from where Captain Randall and his company intercepted the large raiding party the previous week. Upon entering General Gregan's pavilion, Ludmilla's suspicions of who would be attending the meeting were proven to be true. "Welcome, Lady Zaradnik," the Greying General said. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "Thank you, General Gregan," she replied. "Will there be no representatives from the 5th Legion at this meeting?" "None, my lady," General Gregan replied. "Their defensive posture has not changed since we last spoke." She examined the men gathered around the table. In a word, they could be described as dour, save for General Ray, who wore a blank expression. Several aides came to update the map of the southern wilderness, and she immediately realized what the emergency was. The demi-humans that should have been evenly dispersed over their respective territories were entirely absent from the outer slopes of the highland plateau. "It appears that your opponents across the border understand what you've been trying to do." "It certainly seems that way, my lady," General Gregan replied. As a result of the 6th Legion's continued aggression, the demi-humans had finally organized. Amusingly, that organization had manifested in the exact opposite response that they wanted. In the Baharuth Empire, no, in the human nations of the region, the tribes beyond the boundaries of civilization were seen as savage, aggressive primitives. If exposed to sufficient provocation, then they would surely retaliate with reckless, unthinking violence. Except that wasn't true at all, and that truth was now staring the 6th Legion's general staff in the face. Instead of falling to their ploy, the tribes of the wilderness had simply withdrawn and were in the process of preparing to defend their homeland from the Imperial invaders. The success that the Empire's expeditionary force thought would be coming their way never existed in the first place. They had placed their faith in a plan founded on misconceptions about their supposedly stupid opponents. Ludmilla could almost imagine them fuming over the result. The fact that the 5th Legion was probably being quite smug about it only added fuel to the fire. General Gregan and his staff were notably absent of energy as the aides walked away. "We can still assault their position," General Ray said. "We'll be ground down in turn." Commander Tillman's black goatee wagged as he spoke, as if to wave away General Ray's statement. "The passes of this plateau would be painted with the blood of our men if we went on the offense." "That's a gross exaggeration," General Ray snorted. "It isn't as if all of them will appear at every point we attack. As imposing as their position may appear, the initiative is still ours to take. They know where we are and they'll know when we move. From this development, it should be clear enough that it can't be assumed they'll remain static if we attempt to exploit openings." "This defeatist attitude is inappropriate for our army group," General Ray said. "Our duty is to find solutions that will help us achieve our objectives, not withdraw into our shells the moment something unexpected happens." Commander Tillman bristled at General Ray's words. Beside him, the 4th Division's commander, Schuler, made a calming gesture. "We do not have infinite resources at our disposal," he said, "neither do we have infinite men. Our newest recruits took 6 months to train to their current state. Losses in a protracted, direct conflict cannot be sustained. Bleeding ourselves dry for mountainous wildland of unproven value will be entirely unacceptable to the Court Council, and we all know it. What about the undead? Commander Wirtz asked. This is the very scenario where they would be invaluable to the Imperial Army's efforts. Did the 2nd Legion not have squads of Death Series servitors at their disposal for a similar situation? Around the table, General Gregan's staff turned their gazes towards Ludmilla. The 2nd Legion was tasked to resolve a specific issue with the Death Series servitors at their disposal, she said. The 6th Legion's campaign is a foreign venture unrelated to national defense. I'll agree that it is a foreign venture, Commander Wirtz replied, but the terms of the Undead Lease Agreement state that they cannot be employed offensively against officially recognized political entities. This wilderness contains no such entities. I am not an avenue through which you may negotiate changes in your domestic affairs, Commander Wirtz. This is the Empire's business, or am I to interpret this as a desire to change the nature of the relationship between the Empire and the Sorceress Kingdom? Faces turned pale at Ludmilla's question. She could have probably worded that better, but she didn't like being treated as some sort of convenient loophole. That's, of course not, my lady. But the most effective solution is to bring the Death Series servitors to bear against our adversaries. Enough. General Gregan's calm voice cut firmly into Commander Wirtz's reply. Lady Zaradnik is correct. We cannot go against Imperial policy and override Imperial law simply because they become inconvenient. Beyond that, standing around making conclusions based on conjectures is not what I've brought everyone in for. We need real information to work with. So you want us to force these demi-humans to give up that information, General Ray said. In a reasonable manner, General Gregan replied. Grinding our men into sausage is not the only way to get the answers we need. General Ray crossed his arms, twisting his lip as he examined the map before them. The aggressive and ambitious man was clearly displeased with the disposition of his fellow officers. You have gone from one extreme to the other, he muttered. A careless misconception has likely led you to yet another. Speak plainly, Ray, General Gregan frowned. This isn't a ball in our winter and you're not pretty enough to make me want to dance with you anyway. I was wrong about how they would react, General Ray said. Since I was producing some results, you all threw your lot in with me. We were proven wrong in our assumptions, but just because we were proven wrong does not mean we go from believing that our opponents are heedless and unsophisticated to thinking that they are a force that can outwit a general and match the Imperial Army. You are simply exchanging one set of blinders for another. We need to go into this with both eyes open. The situation has simply changed and we need to see it for what it is. General Ray uncrossed his arms, reaching down into one of the bags at his feet. A heavy thump punctuated the silence as a large stack of papers landed on the wooden table. Written on the covers were titles and dates, each set of papers reporting a day of General Ray's activities. These wilderness tribes are not Imperial Knights, he said. They do not enjoy the benefits of our civilization. They do not have plate armor, their weapons are fashioned from wood, bone and stone. They do not benefit from the Imperial Army's organization nor its monolithic drive. We are not fighting an army backed by industrial might, complex economies and advanced artifice. Nor are they even an army, not yet. They are simply small, independent demi-human communities subsisting in the wilderness. General Gregan, how far back have movements related to this demi-human rally been noted? Since shortly after that set of raids hit the border. General Ray nodded as if he had expected the response. It has been less than a week since they've started moving, he said. Can a true army form in a week? Can equipment and discipline be forged on such short notice? Can infrastructure and logistics on such a scale be established? The answer is no, not even for hobgoblins. What are you proposing? Schuler asked. It is not so much a proposal as it is simply what needs to be done, General Ray answered. We need to attack. Watching and waiting will only give the enemy forces time to grow in size and strength. We need to smash their foundations while they are still trying to build them. Our divisions aren't ready, General Gregan noted. They've occupied the passes over the Imperial border and it will take at least 2 days for the 4th and 5th divisions to get into position in the west. My men are ready, General Ray said. We can begin our offensive at dawn. Give me the order and I will end this threat before it can rise to stand against us. Those damn tortoises. The single line repeated itself in Ray's thoughts as he scoured through maps, reconnaissance reports and company profiles. Quick to go on the defensive, slow to advance and mired in doubt when opportunities presented themselves. As an expeditionary army, Ray believed that the 6th Legion was in a unique position to become an unprecedented force for change. Change, however, could not come when it was bound by the old, rusty chains shackling General Gregan and the rest of his command staff. Their tradition served them well while the Empire grew and consolidated its strength, but they had also become fetters that kept them from seizing their destiny. How could they expect to forge ahead when they were so averse to risk? So what if men died? More were born in the Empire every day than what they would lose on the front. It was better that they died for the sake of their ambitions than die uselessly in the slums of the cities, living out bleak lives as they fought over limited opportunities like dogs over table scraps. To be certain, it took time and resources to train and equip new soldiers, but a balance would eventually be struck. Hesitation over the loss of life and resources was pointless when they would be consumed no matter what they did. How was Ray the only one who understood this? No, it was more accurate to say that the Imperial Army was at fault. The sword of the Baharuth Empire was stuck fast in its sheath, refusing to carve a path toward the future. He shook away the frustrated malaise that had followed him back from the 6th Legion's meeting, refocusing on the task at hand. Ray frowned as his eyes crossed over an anomaly in his reports. Zaid. Yes, sir? Come over to the command tent. I have some questions about the last battle from the other day. He read over the Dragoon captain's account once again as he waited. With the potential challenges presented by the demi-human position on the Highland Plateau, he had been referencing the attack against the Overlord and its tribe when he encountered an odd inconsistency. A minute after he called for him, Captain Zaid entered the shadow of Ray's pavilion. Reporting as ordered, sir. I was studying the reports on that ridge assault, Ray said, but there are discrepancies between them. Your account credits Baroness Saradnik for the defeat of the Overlord. Baroness Saradnik's account claims that the ridge was taken by a joint effort between her bodyguard and your flight. The other 3 squads that came don't have much in the way of detail at all, but they also credit it to a joint effort. The other 3 squads didn't arrive until the fight was over, sir, Captain Zaid replied. As for Lady Zaradnik, may I compare her report with mine? Ray slid the folders over, gauging the man's reaction to them. It only took a few seconds for him to look about the same as how Ray felt about the Baroness report. This is very, meticulous, General, Captain Zaid said as he continued to scan through the pages. How did she notice all this or even remember it for that matter? Every notable act of her men is recorded in fine detail. She even has things like who hit where with what, the effect, the rationale as to why they did and how it affected the rest of the fight. Then these tactical recommendations. How Lady Zaradnik structured and filled her reports was an anomaly in itself. At first, Ray believed her reporting to be driven by enthusiasm over a novel role easily achieved by one who could afford the energy and attention to watch her men. As those reports piled up, however, meticulous steadily became an understatement. There was no individual that he knew of who could write such absurdly detailed reports while offering the accompanying analysis and insights within a night of the battles in question. She either had unbelievable perception and memory combined with matching tactical acumen and knowledge of martial combat, or she was making things up as she went and neatly stitching everything together. Ray was fairly certain that anyone would believe the latter to be the case, as the former seemed impossible. But she says very little about herself, Ray said. Which brings us to the Overlord. The details about this confrontation make me wonder how you survived. She claimed that the Overlord was at least difficulty rating 63, sir. The Dragoon captain replied, I believe her assessment is correct. Our hippogriffs were coming around to help but she decided to end it right then and there. Decided? Are you telling me that she killed a difficulty rating 63 Overlord with 2 strikes? Like she was some Imperial knight dispatching a goblin that she thought was too dangerous for Academy students on their promotional examination? Captain Zaid looked up from the report, furrowing his brow as he looked over at Ray. That Overlord had next to no equipment, but yeah. The way you put it is about right too. The way she took it down, that first strike probably wasn't needed. It was as if she was ensuring that it couldn't do anything funny to the men as it died. How strong she is shouldn't be a surprise, though. The women who come through the army are always crazy. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if she could punch down a palisade gate. I suppose, but why didn't she report her own deeds if she was so meticulous with the rest? Humble, maybe. Lady Zaradnik stands out because of what she is, but I don't think she's ever gone out of her way to attract attention. Also, she went around asking a bunch of the officers how they submitted reports and how the men were recognized for their achievements. She might be making sure her men get their due, but since she's not a part of the Imperial Army, she's not concerned with earning honors for herself. Or maybe killing demi-humans is just another day for her. She worships the Six, after all. Thank you, Captain. Dismissed. Captain's aide saluted before turning on his heel and leaving the tent. Ray looked over at Bennett, who was sorting through some files nearby. Are you sure that you assessed Baroness Zaradnik properly when she first came in, Bennett? I don't see how it could have been done any differently, sir. Check again, Ray said. This doesn't make any sense. Based on what he knew of the Baroness so far, it was likely that attempts at collecting information about her were being foiled somehow. Aside from that, everything pointed to her being a captain that was at least as strong as one of the great Imperial Knights. Not only did she display substantial personal martial prowess, but possessed an extremely high degree of situational awareness, showed exceptional skill at frontline coordination and produced highly effective tactics using unfamiliar elements on demand. But where had she come from? Was Riestai so insanely oblivious of its talented individuals that she would have otherwise been doomed to obscurity if not for the Sorceress Kingdom? Or perhaps she would have struck out on her own path like so many of the strong. Even the Empire had trouble attracting Mithril-equivalent individuals into its service, and adamantite was entirely out of the question. If she were as capable as he now suspected, he would need a different approach. No change, Bennett said as he rejoined Ray at the table. We know those bags of hers are magic now and we couldn't detect them, so it's likely she's using an item or skill that blocks divination and even sensory abilities. Is she doing it to catch us off guard? Or just trying to stay as inconspicuous as possible? The cleric shrugged. As far as Priest Ward's reports go, she's been interested in learning about the army and the soldiers. It's bad enough that she's a woman, running around like some sort of hero would get in the way of everything she wants to do. A woman, someone that men registered differently as a matter of natural behavior. She would tend not to be recognized as a threat unless she directly indicated herself as one, thus evading the degree and type of scrutiny that threats were subject to. Shouting, scowling, aggressive actions and posturing, she displayed none of it. In a dangerous campaign environment that constantly demanded attention against attacks that could occur at any time, the way that she carried herself was as good as invisibility once the men grew accustomed to her presence. At the same time, the Baroness would be favored in certain ways, which she could easily exploit. Any unwanted advances would be easily turned away by her apparent strength. So, in addition to being a liaison officer and a propaganda tool, she was a perfect observer for what Ray was convinced was a test by the Sorcerer's Kingdom. How could he use that? Could she be used? If she acted to preserve the lives of Imperial soldiers, could he just send her up with a company and have her take stubborn defensive positions? What sort of risks did that carry? Officially, she was a liaison officer. Unofficially, she was an observer. With what he now knew, she could also potentially serve as a judge and an executioner. Keep track of where the word about her spreads, Ray told Bennett. If things get out of hand, she may leave the battalion and start over again in a division that has no clue about her. Which would mean Ray forfeiting any chance of leaving her with the best impression possible. He wasn't sure what the Baroness thought of him thus far, but he wasn't anywhere near done showing her what he and his men could do. Ray's assessment of Lady Zaradnik had developed to the point where he was certain that he could do away with the coddling and treat her as a skilled captain who had no issues grasping his actions. Once he finished updating himself on the battalion's reconnaissance reports, he cleared the command pavilion of his staff and invited the Baroness to join him. Good afternoon, Your Excellency. Good afternoon, Lady Zaradnik. I hear you've been overseeing your men's drills every morning, so I hope I've called you over at a convenient time. I'm always available for consultation as a liaison officer, General, Lady Zaradnik replied. Be it with you or your men. I can only wonder how proficient they've become as your bodyguard. The Baharuth Empire has its own schools of combat. The Baroness touched the fingertips of her right hand to the table. I've merely attempted to instill some good habits that won't interfere with their regular training. What was it that you wished to speak to me about, Your Excellency? Ray gestured to the map updated with information from the battalion's reconnaissance efforts. I've been studying how we can deal with this demi-human threat gathering on the plateau, he said. Honestly, this cautious stance of General Gregan's leaves it to us to make something happen. Instead of fighting to win, we're fighting to not lose. This will make victory more costly by the day. It's a drastic turn from the aggressive posture adopted thus far, Lady Zaradnik nodded. The 2nd Legion was given pause by their first bloody nose in the blister, but the 6th Legion has effectively arrested operations at the idea of getting a bloody nose. You never said anything about that during the meeting yesterday, my lady. I am here to develop mutual understanding between the Baharuth Empire and the Sorceress Kingdom, Your Excellency. I am not here to replace General Gregan. Then, in the interest of developing mutual understanding, how would you pursue this campaign? Lady Zaradnik's other hand settled on the table as she leaned forward to examine the wilderness map. I would not begin with a campaign at all, she said. Some conflict is to be expected given the culture of those who we are dealing with, but fully fledged warfare is far from the ideal instrument of diplomacy in this situation. Why is that? With the forces at the Sorceress Kingdom's disposal, conquest should be a simple matter. The 6th Legion does not have the forces of the Sorceress Kingdom at its disposal, Lady Zaradnik replied. If it did, however, the answer should be obvious if you consider the state of affairs in the Sorceress Kingdom. We encourage harmonious coexistence between our citizens, and our citizens are not solely human. Framing ourselves as a belligerent force in the eyes of the world is at odds with our domestic and foreign policies. In that case, why has the Empire been allowed to conduct this campaign? Because the Empire is a client state of the Sorceress Kingdom. It is not the Sorceress Kingdom and has mostly been allowed to govern itself thus far. There is technically nothing wrong with the Empire expanding its borders into the unclaimed territories surrounding it. Even war with other countries is not out of the question so long as suitable justifications exist. The Sorceress Kingdom has expanded its territory and waged war with foreign powers when necessary, so it would be hypocritical of us to demand that the Empire refrain from doing the same. Furthermore, amicably joining hands with the Sorceress Kingdom is not supposed to be a death sentence for the ambitions of our allies. He examined the Baroness' handsome features as she conveyed herself in the same, neutral way that she often did. Frankly, it was difficult to say where she personally stood on the matter. On one hand, she spoke in the professional manner of an imperial officer, acting as an instrument of her government's policies. On the other hand, she did little to discourage the battalion's operations even when they appeared to be at odds with those policies. At what point would she act in opposition? Would she at all? Or would she leave without a word, leaving them to wonder if some judgment would be rendered upon them by the Sorceress Kingdom's royal court? Speaking of ambitions, Your Excellency, Lady Zaradnik said, you have had much to say about achieving those of the Empire and your men, but I haven't heard anything about yours. Ray's hand fell to the table at Lady Zaradnik's pointed statement. As the silence stretched between them, she reached into a pouch at her hip, producing a dark, ovoid crystal that fit into the palm of her hand. She set it down on the table, running a finger lightly over its smooth surface. The air grew still, cutting away the sound from outside of the pavilion. No one outside can hear you, Your Excellency, the Baroness said. If that was your worry. Ray studied the Baroness, tracing the clean lines of the noblewoman's face. After a moment, he let out a sigh. Nothing I've said in all this time got through to you, did it? Was it all merely polite conversation? And now you ask me directly, honestly expecting a direct and similarly honest answer. Is there something wrong with that? You're lucky that you were sent to work with the Imperial Army, my lady, Ray said. Dealing with anyone else in the Empire would have seen you devoured. Or maybe you were sent precisely because you are what you are. And what am I, Your Excellency? A terrible diplomat, Ray told her, and an abysmal politician. You act with raw charisma and believe that you can force your way through the world with hard work and genuine feelings. We have thousands of people like you in the Imperial Army, which makes you the ideal individual to send as a liaison officer. At least from their perspective. I suppose I expected something else entirely from a representative of the Sorceress Kingdom. He saw it now. He saw it and his mood turned dark upon seeing it. She was one of them, with all of their ridiculous values and attitudes. The way that she remained stone-faced upon receiving his scathing words was the same, too. She didn't care about herself, she was an instrument of her master's will. The Baroness would go where she was told to, strike others down as ordered and die at a word. She would do so with pride, because she believed that it was right. That she was strong, skilled and intelligent did not bother Ray. If anything, it only garnered his admiration and respect. What bothered him was her attitude of selfless service, of stoic sacrifice and stubborn resolve. An attitude that allowed empires to be built upon the backs of those who were fooled into believing in something greater than themselves. One that brought undue suffering to the honest and gullible while at the same time catapulting those who would exploit them to the heights of wealth and power. Just like Ray's father and mother and their parents before them, just like General Gregan and the commanders of the 6th Legion, just like so many imperial officers all across the empire, Baroness Ludmilla Zarodnik was a martial noble through and through.